Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into a conflict that most people have never even heard of, but one that reveals a hidden fault line in the power dynamics of early 19th century empires. This is the story of the Anglo-Turkish War. It's obscure, yes, but far from irrelevant, because behind the cannon fire and diplomatic blunders lies a question that still haunts global politics today. What happens when a fading empire tries to play the middle between giants? Let's set the scene. It's the early 1800s, and Europe is not just at war, it's on fire. Britain and France, the two major powers of the age, are locked in a global death match, the Napoleonic Wars. And I don't mean just a few soldiers trading volleys on the continent. This is full-scale geopolitical chess, spanning continents and pulling in entire regions, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The Ottoman Empire? Right smack in the middle. Now, picture this. The Ottomans are standing on a crumbling cliff, centuries of imperial power behind them, but the ground beneath their feet is shaking. They're no longer the unchallenged superpower of the Islamic world, nor are they modern enough to keep pace with the industrializing West. And yet, every European power still wants a piece of them, or to keep them just strong enough not to collapse. Britain, in particular, is getting nervous. Why? Because the French are starting to whisper sweet nothings into the ears of the Ottoman elite in Constantinople. Diplomatic gifts, military advisors, promises of partnership, it all adds up to a terrifying scenario for London. If Napoleon gains real influence over the Ottoman court, that puts British interests in India, Egypt, and the Mediterranean at serious risk. So what do the British do? They don't wait around to find out. They lean in, hard. But this isn't just a story about two empires playing tug-of-war with a third. It's a deeper story about sovereignty, overreach, and what happens when imperial powers mistake intimidation for strategy. And as we'll see, that miscalculation would come at a high price. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk about how this powder keg actually ignited. Britain, ever the global power player, decided it was time to draw a line in the sand. They issued an ultimatum to the Ottoman Empire: break off your alliance with France, or face the consequences. Now imagine the audacity of that. One empire demanding another empire give up its diplomatic autonomy, as if it were some colonial satellite rather than a centuries-old sovereign state. But here's the twist: Sultan Selim III didn't blink. The Ottomans refused, not because they were confident in their military strength, but because sovereignty still mattered. And for a crumbling empire, that dignity, however fragile, was something worth defending. The British had made a fatal assumption. They thought the Ottomans would fold easily, bowing to naval pressure and abandoning France without protest. Instead, the Ottomans held their ground. Why? Because giving in would have meant surrendering what little independence they had left. And history shows us something important here. The more you try to force a decision down a nation's throat, the more likely it is to choke on it and resist. Meanwhile, underneath all of this was a deeper structural tension. The Ottoman Empire wasn't like Britain. It wasn't centralized, clean-cut, or governed by rigid bureaucracies. It ran on relationships, loyalties, and a patchwork of regional powers. Governors, janissaries, provincial elites, they didn't always answer to the capital. The Ottoman state was a living mosaic, not a well-oiled machine. And that kind of structure doesn't take kindly to coercion from outside. So when Britain tried to impose the logic of a centralized empire on a decentralized one, they didn't just miscalculate, they misunderstood the entire system. And as we'll see next, they tried to back that misunderstanding with brute naval force. When diplomacy failed, Britain reached for its favorite tool: gunpowder. Enter the Dardanelles operation. Think of it as a classic show of force. The British Royal Navy, confident and unchallenged on the seas, steamed into the narrow waters separating Europe from Asia. The goal? To intimidate the Ottomans into submission. A quick display of firepower, shock and awe, early 19th century style. But here's the problem. This wasn't some pirate stronghold or backwater colony. This was the Ottoman Empire, and while it may have been aging, it wasn't defenseless. The straits were fortified. Coastal batteries lined the cliffs. Ottoman gunners, prepared and determined, opened fire, and the British ships, crammed into a narrow channel with limited maneuverability, took hits. Serious ones. This wasn't supposed to happen. The British had assumed the Ottomans would cower, that they'd be overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the Royal Navy. But instead of folding, the Ottomans fought back hard. They understood the terrain. They were defending their homeland. And they weren't just fighting to survive a battle, they were fighting to preserve what remained of their political dignity. And here's where it really unravels. The British plan didn't account for logistical strain. Their ships couldn't push forward. Their supply lines were stretched thin. And most importantly, they didn't achieve anything. No surrender, no treaty, just damage, death, and withdrawal. In the end, the Dardanelles operation wasn't just a military failure, it was a diplomatic embarrassment. A case study in how empires can overestimate their strength, underestimate their opponent, and launch wars based on illusion rather than reality. But if you think the British were the only ones dealing with dysfunction, wait until we peek inside the Ottoman house itself. So, while the British were misjudging from the outside, things inside the Ottoman Empire weren't exactly stable either. Let's talk about Sultan Selim III. He was trying something bold: modernization, and not just in a cosmetic sense. Selim wanted to reform the military, update the bureaucracy, and bring the empire into the modern age. You could say he was thinking ahead of his time, maybe even laying the groundwork for what would later become the Tanzimat reforms. But here's the catch: reform in an empire isn't just about policy, it's about power. Enter the Janissaries. Originally an elite fighting force, by the 18th century they had become something else entirely: a privileged military caste. Armed, political, and deeply invested in the old ways. And guess what? They didn't like change. When Selim tried to implement reforms, the Janissaries pushed back. Not with debate, but with force. Because modernization threatened their privileges, their influence, their control over the system. Reform wasn't just administrative, it was existential. And this is where British strategy really stumbles. London believed the Ottoman Empire was a unified state. One sultan, one army, one chain of command. But that was far from the truth. What they didn't see was the internal fragmentation, the regional warlords, the semi-autonomous provinces, the fact that the capital's authority didn't always reach the provinces. The Ottomans weren't one empire. They were a collection of moving parts that sometimes spun in different directions. So, when Britain assumed that Selim could make decisions for the entire empire, they were playing checkers on a chessboard. They misunderstood the internal politics, underestimated the resistance to reform, and totally missed the fractured reality on the ground. And that failure to grasp the empire's internal mechanics, it would have serious consequences when it came to trade, territory, and the global economy. Now let's get to the heart of the matter: money. Because let's be honest, this wasn't just about alliances and pride. At its core, this war was economic. And in the early 19th century, economic power was measured not just by what you produced, but by the routes you controlled. The Dardanelles, for example, wasn't just a scenic waterway. It was a choke point, a narrow stretch of sea that controlled access between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Whoever held it could squeeze trade, redirect resources, and control tariffs. In other words, it was a geopolitical pressure valve. Britain, with its vast colonial networks, depended on trade routes like these to move goods, troops, and capital. And with France sniffing around Ottoman ports, the British feared losing their grip on one of the most strategic arteries of global commerce. This wasn't paranoia. It was economic survival. But it gets even more interesting. The British and Ottomans didn't just clash over territory. They clashed over ideology. Britain favored freer trade, at least when it benefited them. The Ottomans, by contrast, often used tariffs and taxes to maintain local control and generate state revenue. From London's perspective, this was backward. From Constantinople's perspective, it was necessary. So this wasn't just a battle between two empires, it was a collision between two economic systems. One powered by market expansion, naval supremacy, and centralized control. The other, a decaying but still sovereign empire trying to defend its financial independence with policies that had worked for centuries. But here's the irony. While Britain sought to keep trade flowing, its own coercive tactics, blockades, bombardments, and ultimatums did more to disrupt the region's economy than any Ottoman policy ever could. It's a classic case of empire overreaching in the name of commerce, and ending up with neither victory nor stability. After the smoke cleared, after the cannon fire faded and the ships limped home, what came next? Diplomacy. In 1809, Britain and the Ottoman Empire signed what became known as the Treaty of the Dardanelles. And if the war was loud, this treaty was quiet, a subdued handshake after a failed fistfight. Let's break it down. First, Britain formally recognized the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire. Now, on paper, that might not sound revolutionary, but in practice, it was a reversal. Just years earlier, the British had been sending fleets, issuing threats, and acting like the Ottomans were little more than pawns. Now they were back at the negotiating table, acknowledging that this so-called sick man of Europe still had a pulse and some dignity. Second, French influence in Constantinople was reduced. That was a win for Britain, no doubt, but it wasn't achieved through force. It was diplomacy, subtle maneuvering, not direct assault, that ultimately pulled the Ottomans out of France's orbit. And here's the fascinating part. The Ottomans may have lost territory in previous wars, and they were certainly on the defensive, but in this treaty, they gained something symbolic. Recognition, legitimacy, a diplomatic "we're still here" moment that mattered in an age when empires rose and fell based not just on their armies, but on their status in the eyes of others. But don't mistake this peace for strength. This treaty was more of a pause than a solution, a bandage, not a cure. The structural issues remained. The Janissary still loomed. The provinces were still restless. The empire's economic arteries were still vulnerable. And yet, in the realm of international image-making, this treaty gave the Ottomans a brief reprieve, a chance to reposition themselves in the chessboard of global power. For Britain, it was a reminder that sometimes, diplomacy works better than firepower. And for both sides, it marked the end of a war that never should have happened in the first place. So, what did all of this really change? On the surface, the war ended. The treaty was signed. Britain got its influence. The Ottomans held their sovereignty. But history doesn't move in headlines. It moves in aftershocks. Let's start with legitimacy, because that's where the cracks widened most. Sultan Selim III, already facing resistance at home, emerged from the conflict weakened. His attempt to reform the empire had failed to take root. His military had been tested and exposed, and his diplomatic balancing act had nearly pulled the empire into collapse. Within 2 years of the treaty, Selim would be deposed in a Janissary-led coup. Reform wasn't just delayed, it was crushed, and this delay came at a terrible price. While Britain and other European powers industrialized, streamlined, and centralized their states, the Ottomans stagnated. The war had drained resources, hardened resistance to change, and left the empire politically paralyzed at a time when it needed bold transformation. Then there's the strategic fallout. The British didn't forget this episode. The trust they once had in Ottoman leadership, gone. From this point forward, their alliance would be more about convenience than confidence. They began investing in alternate strategies, naval routes, regional partnerships, anything to avoid relying too much on Constantinople. In other words, they started planning for a world without a strong Ottoman empire. And finally, there's the psychological effect. The Ottomans had faced humiliation. Yes, they signed a treaty. Yes, they retained sovereignty. But the memory of British ships in the Straits, of foreign threats dictating policy, that stuck. It lingered. It fed a growing sense that the empire was falling behind, that it was no longer the master of its own destiny. This war didn't destroy the Ottoman Empire, but it loosened the bolts, shook the scaffolding, and signaled to the world, and to the Ottomans themselves, that decline was no longer a theory. It was a process, and it had begun. Now we come to the big question. What does this forgotten war, barely a footnote in most textbooks, actually teach us? More than you might think. First, let's talk about legitimacy, not the kind written into treaties or proclaimed by monarchs. I mean the real kind, the kind earned through stability, trust, and the consent of the governed. When Selim III tried to reform from the top down without first securing the support of the people and the military elites, the entire project fell apart. Power imposed without legitimacy? It doesn't hold. Not then. Not now. Second, the dangers of coercion. Britain assumed it could force policy change through intimidation. Send the fleet, fire the cannons. That'll teach them. Right? Wrong. It backfired spectacularly. The Ottomans didn't submit. They resisted harder, and Britain got nothing for its trouble except diplomatic embarrassment and a growing distrust in the very state it had hoped to manipulate. Third, sovereignty matters. Even in decline, even under pressure, the Ottoman Empire refused to let foreign powers dictate its alliances. And while it paid a steep price for that defiance, it also reminded the world that dignity and independence don't always bend to force. Sometimes, they stiffen in its face. But the lesson that lingers most? You cannot blueprint empire onto systems that don't fit it. Britain thought it could project its centralized logic onto a decentralized Ottoman structure, that it could strong-arm a region without understanding its culture, its factions, its complexity. But empires aren't Lego sets. They don't snap together. They're ecosystems. And if you don't understand the terrain, you get lost. This war may be obscure, but its lessons echo through time, because the core tension hasn't gone away. Top-down interventions, misread alliances, short-term force versus long-term legitimacy. These aren't just Ottoman problems. They're the problems of empire itself. So let's step back. What if, instead of always telling history through the eyes of the empires at their peak, through parades, victories, and capital cities, we told it from the edges, from the margins, from the moments when things were fraying, fragile, or misunderstood? The Anglo-Turkish War isn't famous. It didn't redraw maps or produce heroic monuments, but it shows us something more valuable than glory. It reveals what happens when systems collide, when an empire in decline stands its ground, when a superpower misjudges its influence, when reform dies not in battle, but in the silence of resistance. It also challenges the way we talk about power, because power isn't just what you can force someone to do. It's also what they choose to do when no one's watching. The Ottomans didn't win this war, but they didn't collapse either. They bought time. They defended sovereignty. They reminded us that dignity often hides in defiance, not in dominance. And maybe, just maybe, If we stopped studying empire as a blueprint for greatness and started studying it as a cautionary tale, we'd see our own world more clearly. We'd ask better questions, and we'd learn to recognize when power is actually unraveling, even if the banners are still flying. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. For deeper dives and extended discussions, check out the podcast version of this episode, links in the description. And if you're hungry for more forgotten wars, unexpected insights, and untold stories that flip the script on the past, stick around. We've only just begun.